Everybody hear me at the back? Cool, okay. Yeah, so as Rick just said, this isn't the web VR talk. So if you're in the wrong, if you're in the wrong talk, I wouldn't be offended if you left now. But if not, if you're here to talk about and learn about going cross-platform with ASP.NET Core, then hopefully you'll get a lot from this. So a quick bit about myself. My name's Joe Woodward, software engineer at Just Eat. I love what I do. I've been doing this since I was a child. I go to work every day. I'm like a kid in a candy store. I love building stuff, basically. Contact me on any of the various channels there. I love talking to developers and people locally. So, please feel free to get in contact. Before I begin, to get an idea as to kind of the spread of people, are you all .NET developers? Like, hands up if you're a .NET developer. Okay, PHP? Okay. A few chuckles there. I wasn't going to say anything. What about JavaScript? Like Node.js? Yeah, okay, cool. All right. So, yes, hopefully there'll be something here for everybody. I've kind of targeted it to a broad range of people. So, the agenda. First of all, go through what .NET Core is. There's some people may not be entirely sort of clear on the differences between .NET Core and the .NET Framework. We'll clarify that. Why we need a .NET Core, why the framework wasn't good enough. We'll jump into some .NET Core, and then we'll get our hands dirty with some code, and hopefully the technical gods will be kind to me. So, about 2 years ago, the first time I heard Microsoft talking about going cross-platform with .NET Core, I was like, what? This is Microsoft. These guys are evil, They don't like open source software. They don't like going cross-platform. What is this? But as a lot of people have started to notice over the past sort of year or two, Microsoft have changed the way they do things, the way they build things. It's starting to become a lot more inclusive about the frameworks and the technologies they've used. With the introduction of the cloud, this has kind of also shaped their decisions. And as a result, they're really keen now to move the .NET framework, which is a fantastic framework for the .NET developers here. It's a great framework, and actually moving it natively across platform. So beforehand, we had things like Mono, which would do the job, which we'll cover in a moment. But this is a native runtime. So before we move on to that, why a new .NET framework? Well, first of all, the .NET framework was released in sort of early 2000s. It's got a lot of legacy behind it. It was tightly coupled to the operating system. If you're building ASP.NET applications and web applications, then it's tightly coupled to system.web, which results in it being very bloated. You start building a .NET application or an ASP.NET application, you start having to include a lot of things that you don't necessarily need, and that's a problem, especially when you start looking at cloud-based architecture and serverless architectures as well. The introduction of the cloud. Microsoft as well, one of their big products is Azure. And as a result of that, that's kind of shifted and changed the way we develop software. The server is now becoming a bit more of an implementation detail. We've got platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, which started to change all of this. We've also got containers as well and lightweight deployments. Again, you can't have a big bulky framework that has been around for sort of 16, 17 years and really kind of have that agility that you have of some of the competitors these days, such as Node.js. And Microsoft realized this. Serverless architectures, again, things like AWS Lambda functions. You want to do .NET in there, you can't have a large runtime there that has to start up. You have to have something a bit smaller. Also, pressures from competition. The modern framework today we see is vastly different than the framework we see of sort of 16 years ago. You look how quick it is to get started and doing node development. It's just a case of running a single command and then you're off. And as a result, Node has done really, really well. And there's some fantastic tools out there for it. And this is all part of kind of the new Microsoft. The old Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer are out now. And we've got the new CEO there. And as you've seen with some of their recent innovations, they're quite keen to demonstrate that they are a completely separate company. And hopefully this talk will demonstrate that. So what is .NET Core? .NET Core, as I said at the beginning, is a native cross-platform runtime. It's not Mono. If you hear .NET running cross-platform, it's usually on top of Mono, which is like an open source implementation of the .NET framework. But this is actually now a native runtime developed by Microsoft to work across all major platforms. It's far more modular, so they've teased apart the framework, the .NET framework, and they've turned them into NuGet packages, which is a package manager system, which allow you to kind of have a bit more fine-grained control over the dependencies you start to include in your application. As a result, we've got a lower memory footprint, which has resulted in all sorts of performance gains, which we'll go through shortly. And as a result of this as well, you've also got a far more flexible deployment, because they've teased apart all these parts of the framework now. You can actually bundle the runtime and the framework in with your binary, and actually just deploy a binary and not having to have the CLR, the runtime there installed on the base system. For the people that don't do .NET, sort of PHP developers and JavaScript developers, you'd have to have the .NET framework running and installed on the system. But these days, when you start to look at kind of cloud-based architectures, you don't want to have to look after this large framework. It's almost like you want to bundle your runtime in with your application, and .NET Core allows you to do that. They've introduced a command line as well. So traditionally, the .NET framework and ASP.NET was very tool-centric. You had to use things like Visual Studio and IIS to kind of control and manage the instances, whereas now you've got a baked-in a CLI, which makes for things like integration into deployment pipelines a breeze, and also makes getting set up really, really painless. But at the same time, you've still got all that regular .NET awesomeness that everybody's come to love. We've got powerful loungers, C#, F#, fantastic loungers. Roslyn as well. For those of you that don't know, Roslyn is a compiler as a service that .NET have, and it's one of those features that a lot of languages don't have, which essentially is a compiler. As I say, a compiler as a service where you can start to analyze code and build all sorts of really interesting tooling around it, and as a result, you've got some great tools available using it for sort of static analysis of applications, and the ability to kind of write unit tests that will test for code smells and things like that. So what does the runtime look like in this day and age? And so we've got the .NET Framework 4.6 as it is. That's completely independent now. That's separate from the .NET Core. They are separate runtimes. We've got the .NET Core over there with the Mac, Linux, and Windows support. And then you've got your libraries on top. So the .NET 4.6 libraries still exist, the ones that everybody's used to. But we've now got the separate libraries, the .NET Core-specific libraries that all follow something called the .NET Standard, which as long as you follow the .NET Standard and target a particular standard, then your code will work across platform. And with ASP.NET Core, the web framework, the distinction there with ASP.NET Core is a web framework for those that aren't so .NET savvy. ASP.NET Core is a web framework. .NET Core is the runtime, very much the same with the .NET framework versus ASP.NET. ASP is the web platform. It works both on .NET Core, so it will work across all the platforms, but it will also run on the full framework, which means that if you're a company and you're looking at, broadening your options for deployment, you can start by deploying to just the old framework and then start to migrate over to the new runtime as time moves on. So jumping into ASP.NET Core, where's my water gone? There we go. Jumping into the web framework. So for those of you that use ASP.NET Core, MVC, that same familiar framework is still there. However, what they've done is they've redesigned it from the ground up to be a bit more of a modern framework, whereas before you had your kind of global ASAX.cs file, which is kind of the bootstrapping file, to kind of get everything up and running, which is sort of very tightly coupled to the server it was running on. Now they've got a bit more of a composable architecture where you can start to introduce middleware into your application. So MVC now is a middleware layer. And you start to have some really kind of interesting middleware frameworks appearing, which kind of you can just tie in, which we'll go through in a moment. We've got a unified framework. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the .NET, originally had Web API, which is kind of their like a web-based API framework, and then you had MVC, and they were very much separate frameworks. And there were some sort of inconsistencies between the way they worked, and sometimes you had some friction there. Now, though, they're all essentially the same thing, and you can jump between them in a single application without any problems. Composable H3 Pipeline, this is where the middleware comes in. If you've got any cross-cutting concerns, it's very kind of Node.js-like for the JavaScript developers there, where you can start to introduce any cross-cutting concerns into your HTTP pipeline or anything that sits on that HTTP layer. Built-in ISO container out of the box as well, so now everything's far more testable. object instantiation and creation can be managed via a container, which makes everything a lot easier than trying to sort of pigeonhole and use object factories and sort of dirty methods to be able to try and manage dependencies. All of that is gone. And a simple console entry point. So before, you'd have an IS dependency. You'd have to hook up a process in IS to get your application up and running. Now it's a simple case of just calling .NET website.dll and actually executing the DLL just as it is. And being an ex-PHP developer, I can go back to Linux, which when I heard Microsoft, saying that, I was chuffed. A few people get to see where I'm coming from. Yeah, so the middleware. Before we move into an application, the middleware pipeline, the way that works is you essentially start to bundle in your middleware, and one piece of middleware will then call the next piece of middleware, and it creates this nice sort of chain of synchrony through them. And then all that happens is the request goes in, and then the response comes out. But as you'll see in a moment, when you start to compose an application out of middleware layers, I need to make sure that I don't get the shadow on there. I tend to walk about when talking. You start to have a far more composable application. All of this as well, earlier on we talked about a lower memory footprint. All of this has resulted in some fantastic memory performance gains. The .NET team from the get-go. Anybody here know the Tech in Power benchmarks? Hands up. One person. Stu at the back there. Good job. So the Tech in Power benchmarks are a popular and common set of benchmarks that people are using these days to be able to kind of see where a framework or a language stacks up against another language. And .NET at the time was very much down the bottom there because it was running on top of Mono, and that's how kind of the Tech in Power benchmarks ran. And their goal was to elevate it up through the ranks and get it up there at the top near sort of the Java and the Netty, and they've certainly done that. And with all of this being open source as well, they've had a lot of great open source contributions from people that have resulted in some seriously great gains. First of all, because the framework is a lot more modular, you programmatically pay for what you use. So whereas beforehand, the system.web library, which is kind of the core HTTP library that you use in a web-based application, there's a HTTP context, and per request, I think that was about 30 kilobytes per request. If you think you've got a lot of traffic, like at Just Eat, we deal with an awful lot of traffic. That comes at a cost. That means more servers, and that costs more. We run in AWS, so those servers running Windows servers aren't cheap. Where was I going with that? With the new framework, though, because they've teased apart all these components, you're now looking at 6 kilobytes per request. So that's a dramatic difference from 30 kilobytes down to 6 kilobytes. Bundled with the fact that you can then deploy it on Linux, it means you can start to kind of cut down the cost of your infrastructure. And also, if you're like at Just Eat, we have schedule-based sort of scaling times. When we realise that 6 p.m. is going to be a busy time, we'll fire up some new VMs. You can start to become a bit more reactive because we all know how much faster Linux is over Windows. Linux just boots up right away, whereas Windows is like waiting for your granny to get on the train. It takes all day. This comes with Kestrel as well. So Kestrel is a new HTTP-based server based on libuv. And for the Node developers out here, you'll know what libuv is. It's an asynchronous library written in C, which kind of really helps sort of process requests. So anywhere essentially Node.js can run, you can run this HTTP server as well. And again, it's cross-platform. And actually, we've got a tweet here by Mr. Steve Desmond, whoever he is. He upgraded his website to the latest version of the .NET Core framework, and suddenly saw a massive response time drop from 20 milliseconds down to 4 milliseconds. And that is not a typo, as he clearly points out. To give you an idea of some of the benchmarks, we've got the old framework up here, ASP.NET 4.6 running on Windows, running the old CLR. You can see it's getting about 57,000 requests per second. It's respectable, but it's not great. Now we've got the new .NET Core framework running on the same hardware, and it's up to 1 million and a lot more numbers. And compare that to sort of Node running on Linux. You've got 127,000 there, which is respectable. But it was great to see these massive gains on the .NET framework, a framework that had been considered to be quite old and stale in sort of comparison to modern standards. You compare it against sort of languages like Scala. They're going after those top sort of Nettian JVM languages, and they're not there yet, but that's their end goal, is to try and get it to that top of the Tech Empower benchmarks and try and get new developers on board to sort of see the differences of what a great framework it is. Quickly grab some water to let you appreciate that slide. It's the best slide for what I'm trying to say is get into some code. I can watch that and repeat all day long. So, if you've got your MacBook, I've got a MacBook here. I went out and I heard that Microsoft was going cross-platform with .NET Core. I went out and it was an excuse to buy a MacBook. I'm still paying off the bill now, the credit card now, but it doesn't matter because I'm writing .NET Core on a MacBook, which amazes me every time. So the first thing you need to do is you need to go and download the .NET CLR. So you go and download the runtime. You go on to .net. It's a new URL they bought. We go to .net and it's .net like that. It's a bit confusing because it's Microsoft. You know, they do these things. They're like, yeah, we bought a really clear, simple domain name. And they're like .net. And like, well, where's the dot go? And I end up typing .net. And yeah, you'll probably do the same. I guarantee it. So you go on to .net, they've got a fancy new website, and you can download your free tooling. If you're using Visual Studio Windows, you can use Visual Studio. Otherwise, you want to head over to the downloads and download the CLR. So in this instance, you'd want to download the .NET Core installer, and that will get you set up. You'd also need the SDK. After that, you need an editor. If you're using a MacBook like I am, you can't use Visual Studio. For the people out here that do .NET development, you'll know. Don't shake your head. Visual Studio is amazing. I see that one gent over there shaking his head. You'll know what a great tool Visual Studio is. Avoiding what he's about to try and say. However, Microsoft, in their new kind of management and the new way they're doing things, they've got Visual Studio Code. Anybody here use Visual Studio Code? Anybody not do Windows development using Visual Studio Code, like the JavaScript guys? Great, okay, great. It's great to see a Microsoft tool being used by other people. I know the Angular 2 team, they all use Visual Studio Code to write Angular 2 because it's got baked-in TypeScript support. So you want to head over to here and download a simple text editor. You know, it's kind of this new philosophy they're pushing. You don't need a full-on IDE installed. You can get going with just a text editor, and it's a fantastic one at that. So once that's downloaded and installed, we can go into our terminal in this instance. Is this all big enough for everybody? I'll increase that. There we go. Yeah, everybody? Yeah, okay. If you can't see it, then do shout. So we've now got our .NET Runtime installed, the SDK installed, and we've got our fancy new Visual Studio Code editor. I best go into that folder. And now we've got this new runtime, this new CLI. You type .NET-H. This is amazing. You know, I'm on Windows. I'm used to PHP development. I'm on Windows. I'm new project. So as soon as I got a CLI, I'm like, yes, Microsoft Go. And down here, we've got, oh, look at that. I need to move that up. Here we go. Can I return this? Return this a few times. Old school. We've got our common command. So this is the CLI is in its infancy. There's scope in here. There's plans to kind of extend it out to allow people to build on top of it. But straight out the get-go, we've got a new command, so we can instantly create a new application. And it sort of bootstraps a simple application you can start using. We've got restore to restore all the packages, build to build it, publish it, run, test, and pack. They all do what they say they do. So in this instance, we're going to go .NET new type, and if we do H there, we can see this is going to get. We can see we've got our various different applications. So we've got a console application, a web application, a library, and a unit testing one. So in this instance, we're going to do a console application. Before I do that, though, I've made this mistake many times. I want to make a directory called console, and I'm going to go into that. I'm going to then go back to this, and I'm going to type console. And now we can see we've now got a really simple console application. And for those of you that are .NET developers, this is a console application. This isn't all the cruft you get in Visual Studio. When you go to File, New, and it pulls down the internet, and you've got this. I can see lots of people nodding their heads here. Like this is resonating with people, isn't it? I saw this and I was like, no, there's got some there like ls-la to see any hidden files, expecting to see something. But there's not. There's just your program.cs and a project.json. So in this instance, all we need to do is we do a .NET restore, and we're restoring our application. We're pulling down. So in .NET Core and in .NET, their package manager is called NuGet. So when I refer to NuGet, that's what I'm referring to, sort of packages. .NET Restore restores the packages for that application. And now all we have to do, instead of having to go into Visual Studio and build it, we just have to go to .NET Build. And there we go. And as if by magic, we've got an application built. So now all we need to do is .NET Run. And I almost fell off my chair at this point because we have C# running on a MacBook without mono. And at this point, I would imagine a round of applause from some of you, but this is old technology, so I'll put it down to that. But at the time, when Microsoft demonstrated this was crazy. This is a new Microsoft, like, wow, it's working on a Mac. Those guys were enemies, but not anymore. So at this point, all we need to do is open up Visual Studio Code. And by default, Visual Studio Code will prompt us, and it will say, OK, well, I can see you've got a .NET application in there. You're missing some assets. Would you like to add them? We want to click yes. This screen is amazing. I want to play some Xbox on it later, but I probably won't be allowed to. If I increase this, Visual Studio Code, because it's built on Electron using TypeScript, you can command increase the size, which is fantastic. So what we've got in here now is our program. So you can see it's just a simple console application there, which writes out hello world. We've got a project.json structure, which is a nice simple JSON sort of file which declares how the project is structured. And all we can do is we can start typing away. What you've also got within .NET Core that they've introduced is the whole concept of a watcher. So if we go into here, I copy this. We can add it to, I'll need tools. Actually, I'll save the watcher till afterwards. We'll jump into a web-based application, actually, because console applications are a bit dull. So, moving on from the console application. You can tell I put this together last night, can't you? We've got, if we want to do a web-based application, we'll do a make directory web app. We'll go into a web app, and then we'll do a .NET, and save me type in, because when a lot of people are watching, you end up typing poorly. We'll do a web. And there we go. We've now got our web-based application. We go into web app. I haven't done it in the same. No, I'm all right. There we go. Cool. This is our web-based application. So if we first of all do a .NET restore, and you'll see how easy it is now to set up a new application, a new web application. Again, the old days of Visual Studio file new. Wait for it to download everything and get set up. It's all over with. So now we're restoring our packages. This is pulling down all those NuGet packages from NuGet, and we're good to go. So at this point now, all we need to do is a .NET build to build the application, and then once it's built, wait for it. There we go, no errors. We do a .NET run. And this is now running, where we can see that we can go to localhost 5000 at the bottom there. So if I open up my browser and I go to localhost 5000, we should have our Bootstrap application. Just like that, simple. And for the .NET developers here, I can hear you guys, like, your mind's blown right now. So if we were to go into this application and see the changes in the web framework, and for those of you that don't do any .NET development, you can get a chance to kind of see what the framework does. You can see the application here running, so as soon as I hit it, it's making all these requests. And what I'll do before we go into the application is I will quickly demonstrate the watcher that they've got baked in as well. So if I go and get watcher simple, which is a nice little, stop this from running. I go across to Visual Studio Code, open this. We've got our application here, expand this, and if I go into the project.json file, I want to add those. And we go down to tools. Here we go, tools down here. And so all I'm doing here is I'm including a package, a NuGet package. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to here and do a .NET restore. And all it's doing now is it will download that package, and then I can show you the watcher and how fantastic that is. It kind of really aids that kind of that that kind of tooling. You're getting something like a dynamic language like PHP, where you're used to developing, just pressing F5. As a PHP developer, I kind of like that. Same with JavaScript. It's nice being able to make your changes, refresh the page, and away you go. C# being a compiled language, it's a strict language. You've got that compile step. So this kind of helps to mitigate that. So if we were to do .NET Watch run, and this is kind of the tooling that you're going to start to see appearing. Now we've got our application in watch mode, so any changes I make to the application, it'll recompile them on the fly, and we can start to get the kind of faster development process you get. So if we now go back into our application, and if we start making changes to, say, the home controller, for instance, here we go, let's add a whole load of text in here. We should hopefully now see this start to change. There we go, so it's recompiling now. So if we go back to our application and go to the About page, I believe it's the About page I did it on. Here we go. There we go. You can see that change immediately. It's not as fast as a dynamic language like sort of PHP, Ruby, or JavaScript, but it does the job, and it kind of speeds up that development lifecycle. So going back into the application, for those of you that do .NET development at the moment, you'll have your global ASX.cs file. As I mentioned earlier, that now doesn't exist. Instead, you've got a startup. And as I said earlier, this is now essentially just a console application. So the bootstrapping file is the program.cs, and you can see there you've just got your normal public static main where you're passing your arguments. So it'd be your command line arguments when you run that .NET website name .dll. And you can see there we're sort of bootstrapping Kestrel into there. We've got some IIS integration. So if we wanted to run it in IIS, we can do so. But in this instance, I'm running it on a Mac, so I really wouldn't need that. Building up a web host builder, and then we're just saying .NET run, and it's as simple as that. There's none of that cruft you have with IIS. You can basically you can get going nice and simply like this. And this essentially kind of creates a startup file, which we'll run through now, which you start to compose your application. I need some water. Oh, that one. So as I said earlier, because this startup file, you start to compose an application, you start to sort of include middleware to build up your application. This is where you start to do it. So we've got some configuration settings there we want to start at the beginning, but the big thing is this configure services. This is where you start to tie in your dependencies. So you've got your IOC container. You want to start setting up dependencies so you can start to inject them. You can do them in here by sort of services.add, and then you can start to add references. Down the bottom here, you've got the services.add transient email sender. So you can start to add all your dependencies and then start to just have them injected into your various different classes. During this stage as well, this configure services, which is hit when the application first runs, you can start to build in your infrastructure. So you've got add DB context there to start building in your entity framework and your kind of database. Add identity there as well to start building membership. And you can see here this on line 50, services.add MVC. It's as simple as that. You want MVC in your application, you just call services.add MVC. It's just an extension method on the MVC middleware, and all of a sudden that starts capturing those HTTP requests. It's in the pipeline there. It's registered in the pipeline. HTTP request comes through. It starts sequentially going through these. It hits the add MVC. Then MVC has got that HTTP request, and it's able to make the necessary changes, and then it'll kind of pass it on down through and eventually just output the output, the HTTP context, and the view and essentially your web application. Moving further down here, you can start to include more and more bits of middleware, so we can start to include use static files. Again, if you're building an application and you don't want a full web framework, you just want to start showing some images, you can ignore all that stuff at the top, just get rid of it, and you can just call use static files, and you can start to kind of compose your applications. If you want a really, really simple application that does next to nothing, you have that functionality there. And to demonstrate this, here we go. Here's configuring the routing just quickly. For earlier on, we included the add MVC up here. You want to start configuring routes. Again, that's all done via this middleware now, so you start to register your routes and essentially kind of hooking your routes up like that. If we were to go into a controller, the controllers themselves, very simple. Home controller, your various different methods in there. So the rest of the application is very much like a normal .NET framework, MVC framework. The rest of it, becomes very familiar. So the big difference I've noticed having moved to it is primarily the sort of the program.cs file and the startup.cs file. So to give you an idea as to kind of how simple this H3 pipeline can be, what I will do is if I go and remove this, all of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a snippet I've got here, which will be async pipeline 1, and I'll paste that in there. Let me just format that nicely because I get a bit OCD about things like that. And then we want to include this. Use Microsoft. Now what we should see is when we refresh the page, go back to the home page, it should be built. There we go. So it's already built that in the background. That watcher's there kind of watching them. You can see the sort of the fluidity there, being able to just refresh the page. You can see all we've done is we've removed the whole entire framework and we've just output a simple piece of text. So those tests you saw earlier, the benchmarks, they were basically just doing simple text output. But that kind of gives you an idea as to kind of how you can start to compose your application. And all this is essentially doing is it's asynchronously calling this context response write async and outputting that text to the HTTP pipeline. Let's go back to refresh this. Oh, that's a bit. So going back to this configuration here, we can see we start to add in more functionality. So we start to compose the application. We've got our add console, so we start adding logging, sort of tying in logging, debugging, and then also we've got this environment is development where you can start to kind of break down your application and say, okay, well, if it's in development mode, then I want this. I want to use a developer exception page. There's no messing around in web config like you had to before. It's all kind of declared programmatically within the startup file. Database error pages, browser link as well. All in there, you can see here we've got is development. If you're not in development, just use a normal error page. Bear with me. So what I'm going to do now, and if the tech gods are on my side, I spent ages going over this. With Dotnet Clr, talking about how you can start bundling your runtime and their containerization, with the application as it is, you can start to make use of things like Docker. So in this instance here, I've got a nice simple. If I go back out of here and I go into the MVC demo in here, we've got a simple application. I did the same thing. I basically just created a new web application. But inside of here, we've got a Docker file. Microsoft have this image that you can use, the .NET image. They maintain it themselves. And to get this bundled into Docker, we've got Microsoft .NET latest, the very latest one. We're essentially going to run these commands that we use in the CLI again. With the CLI, it starts to add tooling benefits. We can start to execute these commands just straight into the CLI and stick all of this application in a Docker container. So if we go back to here and then we start to run, I've already built the image. So if I go to Docker build it, so at this point here, Docker build, I'll let this run. This should pop up. You'll see the Docker build, T-type, Bristech demo. We're going to build our container, and at the moment it's going through and it's building our image based on the application we've got in there, which is the application we saw a moment ago, as soon as it's finished is running. So for those of you that haven't done anybody sort of quite heavily into Docker here, like really heavily into Docker, anybody else? Anybody that's unsure as to kind of what Docker is or... Yeah, okay, all right. So for those of you that haven't done much Docker, Docker is essentially a way of, within Linux, of taking it's like a sandboxed process almost. It's 5 minutes, okay. it's a sandbox process where you can essentially kind of build up an application in a container, run it on Linux in its own sandbox environment. It's likened to a virtual machine. It's technically not a virtual machine. It's a process running in a sandbox environment. But it means that you can start to bundle applications into a container and deploy them and just start up a container, not have to worry about all the configuration that goes in setting up a system. You can set all that configuration up in your Docker container and then essentially just start up the Docker container. And I figured that would be a good demonstration to kind of demonstrate how .NET Core, as lightweight as it is, makes it nice and easy to be bundled into containers. So our image now has finished. So what we can now do is we can then start to run our image. If we go up into here and I call the run command, because I'm terrible at remembering all these Docker commands because there's a ton of them. Docker run. Here we go. So now all we're doing is we're telling Docker to run our image we've got there. We call Docker run, D for detached to say you want it to stay open and remain a separate process. We want to forward port 8080 to port 5050, which is a port we're exposing internally when we're inside of Visual Studio Code a moment ago in our Docker file. That was on in that other one. We essentially kind of exposed the port because this is a process in a sandbox environment. If you want to talk to an outside world or another container, you've got to expose ports and say, well, I want to expose this port so traffic can come in. So at this point now, all I need to do is go to localhost 808080, and if the tech gods like me, then this should be our .NET application running in a Docker container. So now what you could do if you wanted is you could take this container and you could bundle it into a Linux VM that has Docker installed, press run or type the run command, anything like Kubernetes or Docker Swarm, you can start to have your application deployed in a Docker VM. Any questions? No? Okay, cool. And that's great, isn't it? And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. So we have about 10 minutes if there are questions from the audience on that presentation. One at the side here, yeah.
Microphones, of course.
Hi. You're using this at the moment at work. How have you found using Entity Framework with .NET Core?
To be fair, so we're not... At Just Eat, we've got an awful lot of servers. I think at any one time we're running sort of thousands of servers a minute. We're not using it on any core components at the moment. We started experimenting. It's still a very early runtime. The core CLR runtime is still very early. The Entity Framework, there have been a lot of changes. We don't actually use Entity Framework at work. We because it's a microservice-based architecture, we tend to have kind of smaller microservices and use tools like Dapper to kind of talk directly to the database. So I can't give you a good answer on that one, I'm afraid. But ultimately, the benefit is, we're going to eventually look to migrate into .NET Core. But I don't see us using Entity Framework moving forward either. I certainly don't know of anybody that's using it in its current state. But then saying that, we do have a few instances of people using nhibernate, so there's scope there to tear out the old nhibernate and get Entity Framework in there. But yeah, unfortunately, I can't give you a solid answer on that. I do apologise.
We had a question down the front here.
Thank you. It was more about the web services that you're using, so Kestrel.
Yes.
Is that going to be sort of the way forward using this? Is it IIS out the window? That's the bit that's always confused me in regards with the core stuff. What is the sort of web package around it?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. So at Kestrel at the moment, it's still in its infancy. If you were to run it in production, which you can run in production, you need some kind of reverse proxy in front of it at the moment. It doesn't do things like sort of SSL termination. So if you were to run it on Windows, there's still going to be IIS. Microsoft is still kind of keen to it's still an option. People like IIS, and it will remain as it is. But you can essentially kind of use them side by side and use IIS to sort of pipe the requests straight to Kestrel. But in terms of Linux, if you want to run it on a Linux environment like I do, then you're going to need something like Nginx in front of it. Moving forward, though, they've said that they do want to build it out into a feature-rich HTTP web server. So it could be one day that you don't need that reverse proxy in front of it. But at the moment, if you were to go and put this into production, you'd want something in front of it. And they're very clear about that as well when you get into the documentation. Another question.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just about support with the .NET framework being
Yes.
4.6, and they said like 4 years they're going to support it for, from Microsoft's point of view. With this more being MVC based and framework being web form based, would they basically just increase the version 4.7, 4.8 when ASP.NET 5 has now become Core 1? It's sort of getting an understanding of what are they pushing everyone down the core route now? Do you see that?
It's crazy Microsoft naming as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
It gets so confusing. You've got MVC 5, and then it was originally called DNX, and people thought it was DNX, and you've got .NET Core. And so, like, Microsoft haven't said they're going to retire the .NET framework. I'm fairly certain .NET framework will continue to live, but they have hinted that .NET Core they see it as the future of the .NET framework. Microsoft are very good in the fact that, you know, something like web forms, they won't just kill them. They still offer support for them, but I think eventually you'll start to see, you know, it start to get less and less attention as .NET Core starts to take mainstream. They're never going to, you know, they don't want to lose business, so they're never going to cut people off. And there's been certain decisions they've made over the role of the project.json file, that JavaScript, that JSON file we saw, where they've been very keen to kind of make sure that all the customers are happy. So you can be safe knowing that framework will always be there, and they'll coexist for a long time. But eventually, I can see, you know, they'll just stop revving on the old .NET framework, and eventually .NET Core. By that point, I imagine a lot of people will be on it anyway. You know, in the next sort of 10 or so years. That's certainly what they've hinted at, but haven't explicitly come out and say that's the plan, because they don't want any sort of disgruntled customers. Ultimately, because they're paying the bills really, so they want to keep everybody happy.
Thank you. Is F# a first-class citizen of .NET Core? I saw those lovely kind of templates there on the CLI that brought up web projects and console projects. Can you do the same with F#?
It is. Yeah, many people, a gent at the back there, I work with Stu, he's like a massive F# fan, and he'd be in the back there like, yeah, right now. He's not here though, unfortunately, he had to run off, but it is on the same level as C#. At the moment, you can actually do sort of F# on .NET Core, it is supported, but for those templates at the moment, it targets by default C#. There's also anybody that uses Yeoman. There's the Yo generator in there, and they've actually got F# support in there. So you've got equal sort of C# and F# projects there, and they've got a .NET ASP sort of. You type Yo ASP, and all of a sudden you've got a far richer list of projects that you can create. But there is kind of equal sort of. I don't know what the word is, but they're seen as equal. I don't know why they in that .NET type C#, but yeah, they're keen to kind of. To keep that equal as well, because there's a lot of vocal F# developers out there. Any other questions?
No? Okay. I mean, just from my history, I started on ASP all the way back in about 98. I ran away to the Mac on 2008.
Never looked back?
Never looked back.
Yeah.
But actually, I might just have a play now. So
Yeah, well, it's been really interesting, actually. You see a lot of people asking about what .NET Core is and that kind of difference. And when they understand that it's a native runtime, all of a sudden it starts to pique a lot of interest. I mean, C# is a fantastic language. And I've been using it on the Mac, and it's been great developing some on the Mac as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. As I mentioned just at the top, just before we thank Joe for the talk, we are going to have the closing address by Nick. It will be running on this screen in approximately 7 or 8 minutes' time. And then also to remind you, you are wearing around your head what up until now has been a badge to get you into the conference. But if you take this down to Bordeaux Quay straight afterwards, it becomes a token for 2 drinks.
Ooh.
Yes, so don't lose it. If you don't intend to go to Bordeaux Quay, I have a charitable collection box down here for any lanyards you don't want, and lots of friends who will use them. Otherwise, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Joe, not only for the talk, but also actually stepping in at the last minute and delivering a very interesting talk. Thanks very much. Okay,
Great.
grand.
I'm glad to see there was no QR code there to rate the talk. I guess it would go to Sean
Well,
anyway,
there will
wouldn't
be,
it?
but Sean can get the credit.
Rate it really badly then.
If you loved the talk, his name's Joe. If you didn't, his name's Sean.
yeah. But it's not WebVR.